I was sitting at the corner table of the cafe I'd been coming to for months, the one with the chipped windowsill that caught sunlight like it had a secret of its own. My phone lay face down beside my coffee, and I watched the steam rise, thinking about nothing and everything at once. The quiet in here felt familiar, except when she walked in. She came in almost silently, a warm rhythm in her step that made the usual chatter of the baristas seem distant. I recognized her before I realized I should. She ordered the same complicated tea every Tuesday, and I remembered it not because I wanted to, but because the barista called her name with a sort of affection that made me look twice. She didn't notice me at first. Her attention split between her tote bag and a half-folded list of errands, but when she did, it was just for a moment, a flick of her eyes, careful and almost apologetic, before she settled into the seat across from the window. I didn't know why I watched her, really. Maybe it was how her hands lingered on the cup, thumb brushing the rim as if measuring how much heat she could handle. Maybe it was the quiet way she folded the napkin beside her when the tea arrived, a small, unconscious symmetry I could almost mimic in my own nervousness. I told myself I wasn't staring, that noticing was different from staring, and yet I kept my gaze, flicking to her only when she caught mine and then looked away. "Two married women whispered," she said suddenly, as if the air itself had carried the words from someone else's conversation. "We don't tell our husbands everything." The corners of her mouth curved just enough that it wasn't a joke, but not serious either. I laughed softly, a little offbeat, because I wasn't sure what else to do. "That sounds like trouble," I said, trying not to let my voice tremble. She tilted her head, eyes briefly glinting like she'd considered letting me in on something she never did. "Maybe," she said, a pause that was longer than necessary. "Or maybe it's just how we survive." I didn't know how to respond, so I sipped my coffee. Too hot, bitter, familiar. Her gaze lingered on the window then, and I noticed her watch, delicate, silver, catching the light just enough to feel intimate without trying. I wondered what she was thinking. Did she ever notice how small movements, like the tapping of my fingers against the table, gave away how much I was paying attention? The cafe settled back into its usual rhythm, but our silence was different, heavier, as if it held space for words we hadn't said yet. I felt the weight of texts I hadn't sent, messages paused halfway, unsent for no reason but my own hesitation. The loneliness wasn't dramatic. It was just present, tucked into the corners of my routine, unnoticed until someone like her made it visible. Then she stood, tucking her bag strap over her shoulder, and left a single sentence behind, drifting across the table like smoke. "I might be back tomorrow. If you're here." I didn't move. I watched her go, the bell above the door jingling softly, my chest tight in that slow, unspectacular way that makes you notice your own heartbeat. My phone lay where it had been, face down. I wanted to pick it up, to text her something meaningless, something that proved I'd been paying attention. But I didn't. Instead, I folded the napkin she had touched, just once, letting the corners align neatly. Then I stared at the door, wondering what "if you're here" could mean, and whether I would be. The next afternoon, I found myself back at the same corner table, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the pull of routine, maybe it was her. She arrived not long after I settled, carrying that same tote bag with papers peeking out, her hair tucked loosely behind one ear. She caught my eye and gave the faintest nod, and I felt a small, silly surge, like I'd been waiting for it all day. "You come here often," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. Her voice wasn't teasing exactly, just quiet, like she was testing how much space she could take up. "Every Tuesday," I admitted. I wanted to tell her it was more than that, but I didn't. The words seemed too exposed. She smiled then, a little, like she was letting me into a small fold of her world. "I used to sit by the window at a different cafe," she said, tracing the rim of her teacup with one finger. "My ex and I had a routine. He'd always pick the pastries, and I'd spill coffee on the table somehow. Every Tuesday, without fail." I said nothing at first, just listened, watching her eyes flick down and then up again, a shadow of nostalgia or maybe regret crossing her face. It was the kind of honesty you almost didn't ask for, but when it came, it caught you off guard. I wanted to tell her something, anything, but my mouth felt heavy with caution. She glanced at me, and I noticed the slight crease in her brow, the hesitation there, the way she seemed aware of the unspoken rules hovering between us. Age. Experience. The quiet impossibility of whatever this could be. I imagined her life, full of routines and responsibilities, intersecting with mine, unformed and unsure. And yet here we were, sharing tea as if the rest of the world could wait. At one point, she reached for the sugar, and our hands brushed for the briefest second. I wanted to pull back, remind myself it was nothing, but I stayed still. There was a pulse in that contact, a tiny acknowledgement, and I felt it echo down to the pit of my chest. "You're different from what I expected," she said finally, not looking at me directly, but letting the words hang. The way she phrased it made me wonder what she had expected: someone older, someone steadier, someone less watchful. I wanted to answer, to explain myself, to pretend this wasn't dangerous, that the age gap didn't exist, that her history didn't weigh on every cautious step she took near me. Instead, I nodded, folding my hands around my own cup. Silence stretched between us, thick but not uncomfortable, until she let out a quiet laugh and touched my sleeve lightly, a gesture so small it could be dismissed, but it made the space between us feel suddenly intimate. I didn't move. I just let my fingers brush hers in reply, and for a moment, I imagined that maybe she was reaching out not just to help me feel welcome, but because she wanted to know if I was willing to linger in the same risky space she inhabited. When she finally stood, collecting her bag again, she offered that soft, lingering gaze. "See you next Tuesday?" she asked. I watched her walk away, the bell above the door jingling softly, and I realized I didn't know why that moment stayed with me. Maybe because it felt like someone finally saw me. I didn't expect to see her that Wednesday, but there she was, crossing the street toward the cafe with that same easy grace. I felt a flicker in my chest, anticipation, worry, something that didn't have a name yet. We settled into our usual seats, though I noticed a slight stiffness in her posture, as if she was already measuring the space between us. She pulled her tote onto her lap, fingers lingering over the strap, like she wasn't sure whether to put it down or hold on. I wanted to lean in, close that invisible gap, but something stopped me. The air between us was charged, but fragile. "You haven't changed your order," I said, trying for a small laugh, hoping to fill the silence. She glanced at me, a faint smile playing at her lips, then looked away. "No," she said softly. I guess some things are comforting." Her voice trailed off, almost swallowed by the clink of cups and the low hum of conversation around us. I watched her hands as she stirred her tea slowly, deliberately, thumb brushing the rim again. I wanted to reach out, to touch her hand like last time, but I hesitated. Something in her quietness said, "Don't assume this is mine to take." Then, the complication arrived, a familiar face from the street, a friend she hadn't mentioned, waving and calling her name. Her gaze shifted, polite, careful. I felt the tension spike, noticing how her shoulders tightened, how her laugh grew slightly louder than usual. My pulse raced, not just because she was there, but because the world seemed to intrude on this tiny bubble we'd carved. After the friend left, she sat back, her hands clasped over the tote again. I realized I'd been holding my breath. "It's silly, isn't it?" she said, almost to herself. "How people notice things they shouldn't." I faltered, unsure what to say, the words half formed. My hand twitched on the table. I wanted to close the distance between us, to let her know that I was aware of everything she wasn't saying, but I stopped myself. Minutes passed in quiet observation, her gaze drifting to the window, my eyes tracking the slight curve of her smile when she thought I wasn't looking. The cafe had slowed. The other patrons were shadows. I wanted to ask something reckless, something intimate, but I didn't. And then, almost instinctively, we leaned in at the same time, a shared motion neither of us initiated fully. Our faces were a breath apart, and I could feel her hesitation mirrored in mine. My heart thrummed, awareness sharp, every instinct telling me to either step back or not. She pulled back just enough to meet my eyes briefly. "I should," she murmured, but the sentence didn't finish. Her hand hovered near mine on the table, the contact never made, but heavy in possibility. I watched her gather her bag and stand, the air between us still electric, unresolved. I wanted to ask her to stay, to erase the line she drew so carefully, but I only nodded, silent. As she walked away, the faint scent of her perfume lingered, a quiet reminder that the line had been touched, just barely. But once it had, nothing could feel quite ordinary again. I found her on the small park bench near the fountain, the one tucked behind the oak that always dropped leaves too early. The afternoon sun was low, soft, spilling over the pavement, making everything feel more exposed than it should. She was stirring her tea again, the way she always did, slow, deliberate, like it could anchor her to the moment. "You're late," I said, though I wasn't really scolding. The words felt clumsy, just noise filling the silence. She glanced at me, a flicker of something, guilt, maybe, or fear, crossing her face. "Traffic," she said, her voice low, almost fragile. Then she laughed softly, a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. I watched her hands curled around the cup. "Do you ever wonder if this is too much?" My voice faltered. I meant the closeness, the way she'd become the center of my quiet routines. But saying it out loud made it sound fragile, like admitting a crack in a wall I'd been pretending was solid. She didn't answer immediately. She tilted her head, eyes catching the light just enough to show she was weighing something, me, herself, the possibility that we were standing on the edge of something dangerous. "Sometimes," she said finally. "And sometimes. I think it's the only part of the day I can really breathe." The words hung between us. I wanted to reach for her hand, to tell her she didn't have to explain, that I understood more than she realized. But I stopped. The risk was too clear, the age, the lives we lived, the silent rules neither of us had spoken. I imagined the conversation she didn't have with her friends, the eyes she kept downcast when she passed someone she knew. And I realized, this tension, this quiet closeness, it was not just accidental. It was fragile, precarious, and entirely ours. She shifted slightly on the bench, looking at me, then away, and I noticed the subtle tremor in her hands. "I shouldn't," she said, the words almost swallowed by the breeze. "I shouldn't be." She didn't finish the sentence. My chest tightened. I wanted her to finish it, to say whatever it was that she had been holding back, to let the wall crumble just a little. I wanted to tell her, too, that I was willing to hold the weight of it, whatever it was. Instead, I reached for my own cup, fingers brushing the rim, grounding myself in the ordinary while the extraordinary hung just inches away. We sat like that, both aware of the possibility, either willing to name it. The fountain murmured behind us, leaves drifting down, the world moving around us while we hovered, suspended. Finally she turned, meeting my gaze. Her eyes were careful, but there was something raw in them, a truth she hadn't dared speak. "Do you ever wonder what would happen if we—" The sentence broke off, unfinished. I leaned slightly closer, heart thudding, but the words never came. And I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for the impossible question to land, unsure if I wanted it to. Thursday came, and I waited at our usual corner table, the one near the window where the sunlight hit just right. I watched the door open, expecting her, but it wasn't her. My stomach sank in a way I hadn't anticipated, not quite heartbreak, just a hollow pause. When she finally appeared, it was from across the street, not toward me. She didn't look at me. She walked past the cafe like I wasn't there, tote bag swinging, head bent to a phone I couldn't see. My hand twitched toward my cup, stirring absent-mindedly, imagining all the ways I could call out to her, stop her, ask what had changed. She didn't come in that day. And then she didn't come in the next. I left messages unsent, staring at the drafts longer than I cared to admit. My thoughts twisted in loops. Did I do something? Did she? Was it that fleeting look someone had given us last week at the park? When she finally appeared again, it was quieter, restrained. Her smile was polite, fleeting, almost apologetic. I have a lot going on, she said, keeping her gaze low. Some things I can't. She didn't finish, but the implication landed between us like a weight. I nodded, uncertain, my throat tight. I noticed the subtle changes immediately. She didn't reach for the sugar. Her fingers didn't brush the rim of the cup with that habitual care. She didn't look for me by the window. The familiarity, the tiny, intimate gestures, were gone. And I felt the absence like an ache I hadn't known could exist in silence. I imagined a life she carried that I wasn't part of, ex-husband, routines, responsibilities, maybe a child. Pieces of her world I hadn't known, invisible walls I'd never been allowed to cross. I wanted to ask, to probe, to make sense, but I didn't. Something in me told me that asking could fracture whatever fragile connection remained. And so I sat, day after day, waiting at the window, drinking coffee I barely tasted, listening to the quiet hum of the cafe. I imagined her here, imagined her walking past, imagined the conversation that would never happen. Finally, I reached for my phone. Drafts of unsent messages stared back at me. I hovered over a new one, fingers poised to type something, anything, that could bridge the distance. But I didn't. Instead, I left the message unsent, the cursor blinking at me like a heartbeat I couldn't catch. I looked up just in time to see her glance past the window, not at me, then turn down the street. I didn't feel heartbroken. I felt paused. Like life forgot to finish the sentence. The chair across from me stayed empty, and I let it. I let it become a quiet monument to the possibility we almost had, the conversation unspoken, the touch never made, the line we never crossed. And I wondered if she even remembered it at all. It was late afternoon when I found her in the small courtyard behind her building. The light had softened to a gold that made shadows long and familiar. She was crouched near a row of potted plants, adjusting soil around a struggling fern, hands dusted with dirt. I hesitated at the gate, unsure if I should step in or just leave her to this private ritual. She glanced up and caught my eyes. For a second, I saw something unspoken pass between us, a recognition of the distance, the weeks of unsent words, the tension hovering like heat above the pavement. I didn't mean to disappear, she said quietly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Her hand stayed on the fern, deliberate, but the stiffness in her posture betrayed the weight she carried. It's okay, I said, though the words felt inadequate. I stepped closer anyway, letting the quiet between us fill the space. I just wasn't sure if you wanted me here. She smiled faintly, not the full curve I remembered, but enough to break the wall between us. I did. I do. Her voice was steady, though fragile, like a careful hand reaching across a gap too wide for comfort. I lingered near the bench, hands tucked into my pockets, watching her work. I wanted to say more, to confess the thoughts I'd held in for weeks, the imagined conversations, the nearly crossed lines, but the moment felt too real for dramatics. I realized that even in silence, we were speaking. Every glance, every small gesture had been our dialogue. You didn't leave messages?" she asked, tilting her head. There was humor in her tone, light, but cautious, as if testing the air. I shook my head. No. I wasn't sure if it mattered. My voice trailed off. She finally straightened, wiping her hands on her jeans. It matters, she said softly, almost to herself. Then she stepped closer, enough that our shoulders brushed. The contact was small, accidental, or maybe deliberate, but it carried the weight of weeks unsaid. I exhaled, and for the first time in a while, let myself feel the quiet release of holding nothing back. I started, but she held up a finger, a small, human gesture that asked me to pause. She smiled, brushing my sleeve with her fingers just once. "Okay," she said, simple. Not dramatic, not poetic, just real. And in that single word, I felt the tension fold in on itself, leaving us both unbroken, exposed, but connected. We stayed there for a moment, the sunlight fading, our hands brushing lightly, our presence enough. Nothing else was needed. No confessions, no promises, no sudden leaps. Just acknowledgement, quiet, steady, real. And somehow, that was enough. Tuesday morning, 8:47 a.m., and the cafe smelled of toasted bread and black coffee. I slid into our corner table, the one by the chipped windowsill, and waited. She arrived a few minutes later, her totes slightly heavier, a soft scarf wrapped around her neck. She smiled, a small, contained thing, and set her tea down, the steam rising like it always did, catching the morning light. We didn't need to speak much. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden rush of words. Just the familiar cadence of shared presence. I poured sugar into my coffee, careful not to spill, and she stirred her tea with the same slow, deliberate movements I'd memorized over months. Each gesture was a conversation in itself. Later, we walked to the small park bench behind her building, the one under the oak where leaves fell unpredictably. I noticed her adjusting the soil around the fern again, just like before, hands careful, grounded. I didn't offer to help. We didn't need that kind of intrusion. Instead, I sat beside her, our shoulders brushing lightly, a quiet intimacy that had been earned through stolen mornings and lingering silences. Sometimes she spoke. Sometimes I did. Sometimes we sat without words, listening to the fountain, the birds, the distant hum of the city. The world was out there, complicated and messy, but this little bubble, tea, bench, sunlight, was ours. Weeks passed. Tuesdays became routine again, but life around us shifted as it always did. Coffee orders changed, leaves fell earlier, conversations with strangers intruded. Yet we were always present for each other, quietly anchoring in the same way we had from the start. I noticed her glances, the way she held her cup, how she sometimes tucked hair behind her ear when she thought I wasn't watching. And I realized those small things, her presence, her gestures, were enough. There were no grand confessions. No promises shouted over a street. Just a hand brushing mine over the rim of the cup, a smile when she caught me watching, a pause long enough to acknowledge what mattered most. One morning, she let me pour the tea into her cup, a small act of trust that carried more weight than any words could. I watched the steam rise, flickering in the light, and for a moment it felt like we were both exactly where we were meant to be. I don't know when the fear, the hesitation, or the unsent messages fully faded. Maybe they never did entirely. But in this routine, 8:47 a.m., black coffee, small talk, quiet laughter, they lost their power. We were together, not by drama or declaration, but by the simple, enduring choice to keep showing up. As I sipped my coffee, I caught her gaze and saw the same thought mirrored in her eyes, that sometimes, love isn't fireworks. Sometimes it's a shared corner of the world, a remembered tea, a bench under an oak. And somehow, that was enough. Did this story stay with you? What kind of quiet, real love stories do you want to hear next?